Okay, it looks like we are live. Everybody, welcome to Standing for Truth, where, as you know, we focus on the truth of biblical creation. We also host debates, interviews, discussions, and more. If you are not yet already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and hit that like button as well. I am extremely excited for tonight's event. We got another great must-watch show for you guys tonight. We have Sal Giardina back with us today for a presentation on the illusion of evolution's deep time. Now, before I bring in Sal, I want to give him a brief introduction. Sal Giardina is an ordained Christian minister. He holds a BS in mechanical engineering, an MS in geology, is an air transport pilot, a ground school aircraft systems instructor for professional pilots, a Boeing Aircraft Flight Instructor, and he's also the author of In the Beginning, God or Dirt. Also, Sal has been with us 2 times before. I have linked his past presentations and Q&As in the description box, as well as his website. So please check that out for more on Sal. Now I'm going to introduce Sal, bring him into the show. Sal, thank you so much again for giving us your time for tonight's important presentation.
Greetings, viewers. I'm glad to be here. It's a privilege to address you, and you're blessed for taking the time to come and view this program.
Yes, we're excited, Sal. Your previous presentations have gotten a lot of great feedback, and the Q&A sections have been a lot of fun. We've already got a great chat with a lot of great support coming in. Thank you so much. Steadfast and Easy says, God bless you, fellas. God bless you as well, with Ramen with the super stickers as well. So, Sal, was there anything you wanted to elaborate on in terms of the introduction that I gave?
Well, I was also a professional registered geologist in the state for quite some time, and I have published in peer review publications research on geology subjects, as well as I've worked for the Oil and Gas Commission and such. So I have a fairly good background in geology as well as the applied earth sciences.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you for that, Sal. Why don't we get right into the presentation then? The format for the evening, for the audience sake, is Sal's going to be giving a presentation on evolution's deep time, followed by an audience Q&A for about 30 minutes. So please, as Sal's giving his presentation, tag me with your questions. Since our chats get pretty lively, just make sure you are tagging me at Standing for Truth, and that way I won't miss your question. And Sal, I'll hand it over to you. The floor is yours.
Okay, I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint presentation so that you have visuals as well as a short video to see this evening. I want you to know that I do not just give these presentations as an academic exercise. The purpose of the presentations is to bring people to a realization that the true facts of science agree with Scripture, and that people have been exposed to the dogma of Darwinian evolution, chemical evolution, abiogenesis, that is life from non-life, and billions of years of Earth history since the time they were in grade school. And it is not such an easy thing to sometimes show people that it is an actual illusion. Now, as I talk to you tonight, you hear my words and you will see the information presented on slides, but you cannot reach out and grab those words physically, because the information I'm conveying to you tonight is non-material. All information is non-material. And It requires an intelligence between you and I participating to receive that information. And Jesus himself said that my words are spirit and they are life. They are not material. As you receive the word of God, it produces life. And so I'm going to be speaking to you tonight, these immaterial words conveying information to you. So you want to listen up, military, carefully, because I'm going to take you backdoor, open some back doors, take you behind the stage, and show you what's behind the illusion of evolution's deep time. These are some of the things I will show you. I'm sure you may not have even considered or seen before. So just hang in there with me. And remember that the words that I'm speaking are producing life because they do conform to Scripture and the Word of God. So let's begin with the presentation for tonight.
Okay, perfect. I can share your screen, Sal. And once again, a reminder to the audience, make sure you're tagging me with your questions. I don't see your screen popping up just yet, Sal.
Okay, my first slides are showing. I could see them on my computer.
Oh, I think because we did a test run beforehand and then you shut down the share screen, I think we might have to click it again.
Okay.
So make sure the fourth button, just click share, and then it'll pop up video file and share screen.
Okay.
And then once you make it to the main menu, you'll see your entire screen. Make sure you click the box. The little share button in the right-hand corner should highlight blue for you, but make sure you also click share audio.
I did that.
Oh, and here we go. Here we go. We're good, Sal. And so far, audio, video look good to me. Everybody in the chat, before we get the presentation going, maybe give us an okay on the audio, video, and then we can kind of get this going.
Okay, you could see the first slide with me in the cockpit of a Boeing 757 as an instructor. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, we can proceed then.
And then I would recommend, Sal, where it says hide, right next to the stop sharing, I would click that. And there you go. We're good to go, Sal.
And here I am at a quarry in New Jersey, where, if you can receive this, I have seen as a youngster many years ago in this quarry what I believe were human footprints among geologic strata that is dated along with the dinosaur era. But that's another story all in itself. So tonight we're going to look at the illusion of evolution's deep time. Does it even matter? Well, of course it matters, because all of the evolutionary dogma is completely and totally dependent on a foundation of hundreds of millions and perhaps billions of years of Earth history. If that were to collapse in the minds of people, then evolution has no foundation at all whatsoever to stand on whatsoever. So it is something of importance to really look at. What would happen if the deep time disappeared? As I said, the foundation of evolutionary theory would, and chemical evolution, abiogenesis, would completely have disappeared and have no foundation whatsoever. Now, before we start, I'm going to spend about 5 minutes to show you the power of circumstantial evidence. Tonight, everything you see and what you hear me say and the information I convey to you can be classified as circumstantial evidence, okay? Direct evidence is eyewitnesses or the actual location of a weapon in the case of a crime. Or perhaps sometimes DNA sometimes can be used as direct evidence. But as you know, and when we're talking about historical geology, historical events, there is no direct evidence available. One has to look at the circumstantial evidence, just like CSI, the crime scene investigators use. They gather the evidence, and it's up to you as the audience to determine whether you believe that evidence, what does it support, okay? So any conclusion may be possible no matter how improbable. I mean, even if it is remotely improbable, but a conclusion may be considered inevitable based on reasonable evidence. And that's what a court and a jury is instructed to make their conclusions on, reasonable evidence. The judicial standard is reasonable, not if something is remotely, insignificantly, and nearly impossible. Now, as just an example, J. Warner Wallace, who was a crime scene investigator for many years in Los Angeles, has solved many, many cold cases simply based on gathering circumstantial evidence after the cases had gone closed, sometimes for more than a decade. And so he asked one time to an audience at Arizona State University, can a suspect be convicted of murder solely upon circumstantial evidence? Most people didn't think they could, but the fact is it happens regularly. In this case, let's say this person was a suspect for a crime, and all we had was circumstantial evidence. We knew that he was there at the time. And all of this that I'm talking to you is related to what I'll be presenting to you tonight as circumstantial evidence. So if we know this person was there or in the vicinity at the time of the crime, we know that he had a possible weapon that they found. None of these items by themselves can prove or produce a case against the person or prove he's a perpetrator. But when the evidence starts increasing, in this case, the man had access to the place where the crime occurred, and that it was recorded that he had conversation with the person involved, the victim of the crime, etc. Another person saw a yellow Volkswagen Carmangia. I doubt if there's only maybe one person in 100,000 in the United States that would still own such a car, and it turns out he owns such a car as this. So when you look at all the evidence, the unifying evidence pointing to a causal explanation as the quantity increases, and it gets to the point where the evidence is so overwhelming, there is no possible alternative explanation that would fit all the circumstantial evidence. And let me just give you a very brief idea. Like, I have a relative that lives in the Swiss Alps in a small village, and I send him a Christmas card. All I have to do is put 7 items on that envelope. His first name, last name, street number, street name, the canton, which is the village he lives in, the county, and the fact that he lives in Switzerland. And guess what? That Christmas card gets to him every time. Why? Because with those 7 items, 7.5 billion people that live on the earth are eliminated. They cannot fit anyone else on the earth. And so it is with circumstantial evidence. As it accumulates, it rapidly eliminates any alternative possibilities. And that's what I'm going to show you tonight. Just one data set from geology and paleontology, which supports the scriptural record. And it is hard pressed for any evolutionist to satisfy all the evidence with an alternative explanation. So the cumulative evidence leads to a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt. His innocence in this case would not be reasonable. A person could sit there and say, well, I believe this person is innocent no matter what. But the question is just how much evidence do you need once all possibilities are basically eliminated for alternative explanations? So I'm going to show you tonight a cold case, the age of the Earth. There's no direct evidence, no living eyewitnesses, but there are two suspects. A, the Earth stands accused of being 4.5 billion, that's with a B, years old. Scripture contends the Earth is about 6,000 years old. Can both A or B be correct? The answer is no, because by the logical law of mutual exclusion, each one of these alternatives mutually excludes the other. So basically only one can be correct. Is A or B possible? Yes, you may think in your mind that this is possible or this is possible. Conclusion. You, the jury, must decide which is reasonable, however, from the evidence. Does the Bible actually contain a timeline of Earth's history? Well, if so, does the witness of the Earth's geology support evolutionary deep time, or does it support the biblical historical timeline? That's one of the things we will look at tonight. Does the fossil record speak to us? What do the stratified rocks of the Earth themselves say to us? They have a lot to say, which we will cover to some extent this evening. The time frame of the geologic column, which you have heard, no doubt, from your infancy in school, produces a man-centered worldview. And I could just ask the audience, how well is that working for us in our culture? Our culture is essentially falling apart at the seams with so many numerous problems because it is producing a man-centered worldview. Now, you say, Mr. Giardina, most scientists believe the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. This is true. I don't deny that. But do you have any idea out there why most scientists believe the Earth is 4.5 billion years old? Let me enlighten you on something. There are thousands upon thousands of variations of scientists around the globe today. They go from archaeologists with an A down to zoologists with a Z, okay? There are all kinds of doctors, engineers, chemists. I mean, the number of scientists with Bachelor of Science degrees, masters and PhDs is enormous on the Earth. And I agree, most scientists believe the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. But let me ask you this. How many zoologists do you think have any clue as to how the Earth is dated? How many podiatrists or ophthalmologists, though they're very smart, very intelligent, very studious scientists in themselves, being a recognized medical doctor, how many of them do you think have any clue whatsoever of how the Earth is dated? Okay, so what I'm going to show you is that there's very few scientists on the Earth who really understand how the Earth is dated. So again, I ask the question, or it's asked of me, then why do most scientists believe the Earth is 4.5 billion years old? I'm going to give you a very sophisticated answer right now. Are you ready? Can you handle this? Very sophisticated. Why? Because most scientists believe that most scientists believe this. And that is the reason why most scientists believe the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, because as I've just pointed out, how many people in various fields of science, doctors, engineers, have any clue of how the Earth is really dated? Okay, they simply believe that most other scientists believe this, and then they may have heard a few things about radioisotope dating or fossils, and they just go along with the crowd, basically. The modern geological column, folks, is a construct of a very small minority of scientists. They're usually geoscientists, geochemists, some physicists, and geologists. Dating of the geologic column is a merger of two perceived premises. One, the basis of uniformitarian faith in geological processes, with an emphasis on faith. And number two, an unwavering belief in the unsupported theory of absolute dating methods. We'll be touching on both of these tonight. The Phanerozoic column, you may be familiar with, is the sedimentary rocks that cover about 70% of the Earth's surface. They are divided into periods, the lowermost one called the Cambrian period. They move up through the geologic column, through the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, so-called era of the dinosaurs, and the Cenozoic. And they are these various units within here are tagged with certain very discrete times, as if they were perfectly measured and understood. The entire column is claimed to have accumulated over a period of 540 million years. Now, these are rocks that are laid over the Earth, sedimentary rocks by water. All geologists, evolutionary geologists, or creationists agree that these rocks, for the most part, all over the Earth, are laid down by water all over the Earth. With a few exceptions where they are intruded by volcanic materials. The periods are based on the assumption of uniformitarian rates of sedimentation, yielding a conjecture of physical age. This is one of the back doors that I'm opening for you to an understanding of how these dates are pinned to the geologic column. Okay, let me repeat that. The periods are based on an assumption of uniformitarian rates of sedimentation. These assumptions were made long before radioisotope dating was ever applied to the geologic column, and these assumptions have not disappeared. The periods are subdivided into biostratigraphic units, something very few scientists understand. So these individual periods, which are bounded with what appear to be very discrete time frames, are subdivided into biostratigraphic units. They're based upon the Darwinian idea of fossil succession through time. This has never gone away, and this is the fundamental basis of dating these periods. They're classified by so-called index fossils. Within nearly all of these periods, it has been determined by traditional geologists that there are several fossils could be identified that evolved only within that period of time, not before or after. And if you find that particular index fossil, then you will know generally where to place it in the evolutionary column. The problem is a lot of these index fossils over the last number of decades have been shown to be unreliable and to be found in various other time zones, not just confined to one discrete time zone. So the use of index fossils has been, for the most part, shown to be shaky at best. Thereafter, after the time is assigned by the basis of a succession classified in index fossils, thereafter it is assigned the radiometric markers, as you see here. When, now get this, when the isotope ages agree with the presupposed biostratigraphic age. This is the backstage door, one of the doors I'm opening for you. You are not told this in grade school and high school, not even in the universities. I wasn't told it as a graduate student, although I learned about radioisotope dating. I never made the connection that unless the isotope age agrees with the presupposed biostratigraphic age, which is derived by under the assumption of evolution, then that age, the isotope age, is discarded if it doesn't agree. Now, here is an example from the University of Arizona in Tucson, the atomic mass spectrometer facility, where you would take your sample to be radioisotope dated. Okay, this is the actual form, the sample submission form to this university, but it is typical of many of these labs. And let me try to read this for you. I'm sure you can't read the small print here. This is one of the questions they ask when you submit the sample. It says here, expected age of the sample, and please provide any previous carbon-14 dates and other paleo geographic information that you care to submit. Now, if this isotopic dating is in fact an absolute age dating system, there would no need for them to ask you what you already believed what the age of the sample is, because this is the way the flow diagram works. You assume the age of the sample based on the evolutionary position in the geologic column. As I explained to you, that's a biostratigraphic age based on evolutionary assumptions. Then you send the sample to the lab, the geochemical lab, for isotopic dating analysis, and you suggest to them the assumed age to the tech required in the submittal form, right there. All right, then they compare the assumed age that you would like it to result in with the isotopic testing age. They compare it. If they agree, the age agrees, it is published. If it does not agree with the presupposed evolutionary age of the sample from field work, then the age disagrees, and they go, you alter the data or the assumptions, and you go back around, resampling, redoing, realtering, until you get to the point that you get a sample that agrees with the assumed evolutionary age. Now, I know that may be hard to swallow, but this is exactly what is going on. This is not real science. It is not ethical science. Okay, the bottom line is all dating starts and ends with the assumption of biologic evolution. If you don't believe that, you want to ask yourself, why do they require that you fill in the expected age before you ever even have them test the sample? Now let's take a look at the rock strata that is below the Phanerozoic, which is the sedimentary column, okay, below the Cambrian period is what's called the Precambrian rock, which goes down into the crust of the earth and down into the mantle, okay? And this is shown on a geologic illustration, which is in itself is a little bit deceptive. But I'll explain that to you, because this portion of the Precambrian rock is believed to represent 4,000 million years of Precambrian time. That is 4 billion years that the Precambrian rock has been accumulating for about 4 billion years. And they assign these various periods and systems with very neat looking isotopic ages. But you understand that when you are out examining Precambrian rock in the field, most all of it looks basically the same. In other words, you can't really tell in most all cases where you are in the Precambrian section by physically examining the rocks. They are highly contorted, igneous, and metamorphosed rocks, unlike the sedimentary strata. And they have been assigned ages through various dating over the years, and these various periods have been assigned to those dates. The periods are believed to be chronostratigraphic units. In other words, if you remove a sample of rock from the Precambrian basement rocks, as they're called, and you probably will have no idea what age it may be. You may have some idea whether you're in the upper 1/3, maybe the middle or the lower, but until you do a radio isotope dating and you come up with a date, then it is assumed that you are in that particular system. So they're so-called absolute dates, but the dates were determined first, and then the systems have been assigned to them. Now let's take a look at this illusion. This is the Phanerozoic column. This column of the sedimentary rocks is actually should be pasted right on top of this one, and then this one is the most recent. It should be pasted on top of the two. In other words, the 540 million years of sedimentary rocks are represented by these large illustrations here, one on top of the other. But the Precambrian is only represented by this short stack here. And this is an illusion in itself, because the Precambrian in evolutionary terms represents 88% of all evolutionary time in itself. So this should be 5 times as large to give the proper visual representation than all 3 of these stacked together. Now here's what you don't know. It's not common knowledge that 88% of all proposed Earth's history displays none, 0 evolutionary biologic progression. Whoa, well, what do you mean by that, Mr. Giardina? What I mean is that this is essentially no fossils found in the Precambrian rocks, with the exception of a few fossils found right here at the very top. But as you go down through this 88% of all evolutionary time, you do not find, basically, it is devoid of any fossils at all, with the exception of some microfossils. Fossils have been found occasionally in various areas, now down to about 3.7 billion years old, microfossils. Now, what does that mean to you? It means that these microfossils can be identified under thin sections and microscopes, and and have been identified by secular scientists as being living fossils. Whoa, what does that mean? We have the identical microorganisms. They're basically algae, but not all of them. There are various types of microorganisms have been found in the Precambrian. Most of them are algae that can be identified today as being unchanged and living today. They're called, we find today stromatolites, which are fossils, which are produced by blue-green algae. They're called cyanobacteria. The fossils found by scientists in Greenland, this is just one example of a number of them, examples, but the fossils found by scientists in Greenland are now thought to be the oldest evidence of life yet discovered. The research team from the University of Wollongong just reported their stromatolite findings in the prestigious journal Nature, placing the presence of complex microbes on the Earth 3.7 billion years old. Here's the reference here for this particular paper. Now, what does this mean to you? What this means is that because we find these same microfossils living today, and not only throughout the Phanerozoic rocks, through the Paleozoic and such, we find these, but actually on the Earth living today, that they're thought to be extinct, but they're found to be living today and various environments around the Earth. So there is basically no evolution whatsoever for 88% of all geologic time. There is no evidence for evolution, I repeat, for 88% of all geologic time. The fossils found down in the lowest Precambrian, dated at 3.7 billion years old, are virtually identical and can be identified as being on the Earth, doing well and alive today, found in stromatolites in various environments. We also find them in various rock formations. They form what is called algal mats, colonies of algal mats. We find them in the rock record at higher levels, and also living and thriving today. So there's no evolution for billions of years, and this makes it impossible for you to believe in evolution, because there's been no evolution for billions of years, and we would expect microfossils, single-cell organisms of all various living or multi-cell organisms, the microorganisms, single-cell that is, to mutate much faster due to the countless millions and perhaps billions of reproduction cycles that they've gone through, supposedly in this billions of years of Earth history. The time frame of the biblical record, however, produces a God-centered worldview. Many scientists, not all, but there are many scientists, believe that the Earth is 6,000 years old. Why is that? Because God has given us a record of Earth's history. See, he hasn't left us in the dark. Most people are never taught in their churches and in their Bible studies and or history that the Bible contains a record of Earth's history. The biblical timeline can be found from creation to Christ as being 4,000 years old. From creation to the flood is 1,656 years. Now, this has been worked out by many biblical scholars over the centuries. 427 years from the flood to Abraham's sojourn. From Abraham to the Exodus is 430 years exactly. From the Exodus to the start of the building of the temple, 480 years, as diagrammed in these slides from the Old Testament chronology. The division of the kingdom to the destruction of Jerusalem, 390 years. We also have a tie-in. These years are Addo Mundi, that is years of the earth, starting from creation, counting forward. But to tie it in with our calendar, we do have a very good event that happened in 586 BC that could tie it in with our current calendar. That's a whole teaching in itself. Then Daniel's prophecy takes us for another 483 years, direct from the decree to build the temple to the city walls, right up to the crucifixion of Jesus. At 483 years, we back up 33 years for the birth of Jesus, and we come up with right about exactly 4,000 years of Earth history. And this is just a partial list of scholars, partialists, that have looked very carefully over many, many years of their lives into examining the Old Testament and coming up with the chronology from creation to Christ. The average of these is 4,042 years of all these men, and there are others besides. And three of them particularly come up with exactly 4,000 years to the birth of Christ in 4 BC. And this is the reference here is Dr. Floyd Nolan Jones, Chronology of the Old Testament. So rationalizing the idea of evolutionary progression in light of 3.7 billion years of non-evolution is equivalent to jamming a square block in a round hole, as far as the Precambrian is concerned. But now let's look at the Phanerozoic, okay? What about the 1/2 billion years in which these sedimentary rocks, it is claimed, has taken, okay? The evolutionists claim that this sedimentary column that covers the Earth has taken 540 million years. Let's take a look to see, is there a worldwide evidence of a catastrophic rapid sedimentation? What do the rocks tell us and the fossils that they contain? Fossils require a unique preservation. The fact that any fossil exists in rock strata of the Earth is inconsistent, folks. It's inconsistent with the evolutionary deep time of uniformitarianism. Okay, we know now that fossils require very rapid, unique preservation conditions. They do not form slowly over uniformitarian, slow sedimentation in times, which is kind of common sense. Fossils are not forming today. If you look out today over the desert, folks, go for any hike in the desert, you know that it is not strewn everywhere with fossils, okay? Fossils require the conditions of rapid burial. They require isolation from scavengers, limiting bacterial decay. They have to be buried rapidly to limit bacterial decay, inhibiting oxidation and chemical breakdown at the surface. And on top of all of that, they have to survive the irreversible molecular entropy, which you may know from the second law of thermodynamics, which is incontestable. So the worldwide lack of fossils in current oceans and continental surfaces show you that something happened in the past to provide with us with all these countless billions of fossils all over the Earth in the sedimentary rocks. The present is obviously not the key to the past. Let's take a look at the bottom of some of the oceans, okay? Here are some pictures, right? You don't see the bottom of the oceans and lakes with all these fossils on the surface forming. How about take a look at the Titanic, okay? James Cameron, who directed the movie Titanic, he's explored the Titanic vessel many times. Here's what he says. He's never seen human remains. We've seen shoes, we've seen pairs of shoes, which would strongly suggest there was a body there at one point, but we've never seen any human remains. Okay, why? Because fossilization requires a very rapid burial and very unique chemical conditions to form fossils. Even today, it is very difficult for scientists to try to produce fossils in a lab. Some have been produced with a great deal of effort and human ingenuity, but it is not easy to even produce a fossil in a laboratory. Let's take a look at an example. I'm going to take you down through the geologic column to show you the evidence for rapid burial throughout the geologic column as we go down through the sedimentary column. Here is a lower Cretaceous ichthyosaur graveyard in the deep marine slope channel in southern Chile. Okay, here's what the researchers have found. The remnants of these ichthyosaurs are extremely abundant and well preserved. A total of 46 articulated and virtually complete specimens have been found, both adults and juvenile. Get this, preservation is excellent and occasionally includes soft tissue and embryos. Okay, obviously very rapidly buried and preserved as fossils. When we see this throughout the geologic column, the circumstantial evidence begins to point in a particular direction. They say that they lost their orientation, these ichthyosaurs, and drowned and were dragged into the deep sea by turbulent, high-energy gravity flows. Okay? And their bodies ended up in an oxygen-deficient basin, and they were immediately embedded by fine turbidite suspension fallout. Okay? A turbidite is a high-energy, high-velocity flow, a suspension of water and silt, sand, and sometimes even boulders. Okay, so they admit that it had to be an immediate burial by high energy waters. But look, this is where they found these ichthyosaurs. They claim they've been buried now for 140 million years, yet the preservation is incredible. They're even articulated. And they're found in a 75-foot column of in the Cretaceous strata, lower Cretaceous strata. Now, a 75-foot column, according to uniformitarian, timing, would probably take at least thousands of years to form. So the question is, why were all these ichthyosaurs in the same place, buried at the same time over a period of thousands of years in the same place, basically over thousands of years? The better explanation is that all of this accumulated rapidly and they were buried together rapidly and preserved. Here's a picture of a very popular ichthyosaur that is in a museum that was buried so quickly that in the process of giving birth to the young reptile is still inside the mother's birth canal. It's basically a snapshot in time. These ichthyosaurs were large. They're considered to be large marine reptiles, sort of like the dinosaurs of the ocean. Another case further down in the geologic column at 248 million years old. Again, they have found 3 ichthyosaur fossils, nicely preserved, one outside the parent, one coming out of the birth canal, and again, one inside the body of the mother, apparently. Again, another indication of rapid burial, which we find all over the earth. Fossilized in a snapshot of time. There is a fossil pterosaur graveyard in China. Now, pterosaurs have very, very fine, lightweight, delicate bones. Very difficult to find these bones intact. But there is a fossil pterosaur graveyard in China that literally contains thousands and thousands of bones. Hundreds of specimens have been found. Now, they're all disarticulated, but the bones can be found, and quite a few specimens can be put together. The pterosaur graveyard in China, amazingly so, contains pterosaur eggs, okay, that have been deformed in a soft state. They didn't all fracture and bust up, indicating that they were rapidly buried before the eggs were hardened and became brittle. The preservation is so incredible that even the pores to which the egg allows oxygen to go in to breathe, so to speak, can be identified, and the layers, the outer layer of the shell and then the membrane can be seen under a microscope, and then the inner portion of the core of the eggs. That's how well they're preserved, indicating, again, very rapid burial under unusual conditions. It's believed that these pterosaurs were swooped up in a storm and buried so rapidly and violently that they never had a chance to fly away. In upstate New York, we have incredible preservation of these ostracods. They're fossilized crustaceans. They were buried so rapidly that a microscopic examination has determined that the embryos are still available in some cases, and some of the young that were born from these ostracods. The preservation is incredible. What am I doing? I'm taking you down through the geologic column to lower and lower levels to show you that there is evidence of rapid burial throughout the geologic column. Here is an arthropod in which the nervous system, the brains and parts of the nervous system could be identified. Now, this really surprised paleontologists. Okay, this came from the Shangjiang fossil bed in China, which is known for its Cambrian fossils. We're down here at the bottom of the sedimentary column. The eye lobes, the optic nerve connecting to the brain, can be discerned. So what is amazing is that the nervous systems and the brains of animals are very, very soft tissue. Like a jellyfish will just turn to mush shortly after the animal dies. So the animal must have been buried and preserved so rapidly that even the nervous tissues and brain portions were preserved. And we're finding more and more of these as time goes on, are being reported as they're being examined around the earth. Let's look at the mass majority of fossil graveyard environments. They're representative of a mixture of ecosystems. Now, this is what you're not told. Now, those of you looking in here, you've heard of fossil graveyards, particularly dinosaur graveyards. But what you're not told is that within these disarticulated bone beds, as they're so to speak, here's one from the Dinosaur National Monument in Utah. The very often these fossils are found along with marine fossils. In this case, at this location, this jumble of disarticulated dinosaur bones were found with many bivalve clams. Now, these bivalve clams are of marine origin. Why are they deposited in an unlikely place among land animals? But it's not unusual to find many, many different marine organisms, a variety of fish, sharks, turtles, crocodiles, mixed with the bone beds of the dinosaurs. They do not display this in the museum. And I'll throw this in at no extra charge for you. In addition to marine fossils, there have been around the Earth, in all these major fossil dinosaur finds around the Earth, they've been examined by creation scientists, and they find not only are there marine fossils, but there are plants and animals of every hundreds and hundreds of varieties of plants and animals which are found in here, which are modern varieties living today. In other words, these dinosaur bones at the time are plants and animals that show no evolutionary progression from the so-called millions of years of history that they're dated at, so-called, to show that there's no evolution with the plants and animals they're buried with, because they're same type of species and genera that are found today. The museums do not display this with the bones for people to see and understand. Hundreds of thousands of marine creatures were buried with amphibians, spiders, scorpions, millipedes, insects, and reptiles in a fossil graveyard in France. Two paleontologists from the Museum of Natural History in Paris report that the evidence tells a contradictory story. Whoa, excuse me. What do you mean by a contradictory story? It means you don't expect to find land animals and insects mixed with marine creatures together. They say this because some of the fossils are marine creatures, some are definitely freshwater dwellers, and some are definitely land creatures. This is a common occurrence all over the Earth where we find fossils. One last example is the Baltic amber deposits of Northern Europe. They're just north of Russia, I believe, near the Arctic Circle. One of the largest deposits of amber, which, as you may know, amber is a fossilized remnant of tree sap from countless millions of trees that were busted up and extruded the sap and captured various insects as well as small animals in them. Herbert Nilsson, director of the Swedish Botanical Institute, described the famous Baltic amber deposits. Get this. It is then quite astounding. Quite astounding? What does that mean? To find that they belong to all regions of the Earth. The geological and paleobiological facts concerning the layers of amber are impossible to understand. Look at the words he's using. This is not a creation geologist, as far as I know. This type of deposit is impossible to understand unless the explanation is accepted that they are the result of an allochthonous process, including the whole Earth. Now, this is a big term. Allochthonous process is a geological term which geologists throw around. It simply means it's a process in which the buried fossils that you find are not in situ. They did not form and die in place. They were brought in from an external source. So it's the result of an external source process that brought all these various types of insects and small animals together from the zones that include the whole Earth. Now that, my friends, is not a local flood. So what do the fossils say? Do they actually say? What do they tell us? Wow, we've been intermingled with all sorts of strange fellows and rapidly buried alive all over the Earth. What happened to us? Whoa. Okay, are you getting the picture out there? In other words, for every one of these circumstantial evidences, which I've shown you and many more, evolutionary geologists have a rebuttal, of course. But the rebuttal is that most evolutionary geologists are now acknowledging, they have to because the evidence is overwhelming, that these fossils have been buried rapidly. But everywhere they look, they say this was a local flood. This was a local flood. This was a local catastrophe in this area that buried these fossils. Okay, but when you keep using the word local, and it applies to nearly every deposit all over the Earth, I mean, you could drop the word local, okay? This is a universal condition that is basically found all over the Earth, and a universal condition requires a universal catastrophic flood. Let's see what the rocks tell us now. We looked at the paleontology briefly, but let's look at what the rocks, the structure of the rock strata themselves. We'll take a look at sand pipes and dikes. We won't have time to cover folded strata. That's interesting in itself. Okay. Sand pipes are and dikes have been extruded up from a lower sedimentary bed that was saturated with sand, buried under high pressure, and the pressure, something triggered the pressure to extrude the sand water slurry up through the rocks. It's almost without question that in order to do that, the overburden over the source layer had to still be in a soft state, not in a solid rock state, in order to extrude this up through them. They're called injectites or seismites because most of the time this phenomena occurs during earthquakes from the energy of an earthquake. In Utah here, we'll look at a cross section, okay, in Utah of strata that is believed to have accumulated by evolutionary standards over a period of 10 million years. Throughout this column are these sand pipes that have been extruded up from lower beds up through about 800 feet of this column. This is the geologic section on a geology map corresponding to this area in Utah. It represents about 835 feet. That's an enormous layers of sandstone and shale and sedimentary rocks. How does this phenomena happen? What could cause this? Well, we know what causes it. It's a phenomenon known as liquefaction. The water pressure increases when due to an earthquake. the energy of an earthquake in most cases. It could cause the water pressure of a saturated sand layer if the layers above it accumulate so rapidly that the weight of the overburden itself could overpressurize the source bed. That is a possibility. But in many cases, the evidence seems to indicate that the liquefaction is caused by a saturated sand bed in which the sand particles, due to the energy of the earthquake, separate from each other and form a slurry. And that slurry, from the pressure of the earthquake and the overburden itself, is injected up through the column in the form of sand pipes or dikes, forming at the surface, in some cases, what are called sand volcanoes. The water pressure increases, forcing the sand grains apart and up through the overburden. Here is a picture here for you to see this destructive force of liquefaction in the subsurface when an earthquake occurred. The foundation of these buildings caused them to basically collapse because of the liquefaction of the materials below the surface. This is not an uncommon situation, unfortunately. And as an engineering geologist, that's part of some of the things I would do in investigating a site to see if it has a potential for liquefaction. This short video will show you what happened to a small village in New Zealand, which is called Christchurch. And notice when you watch this short video how rapid the phenomena of liquefaction occurs and how destructive it is, how much energy is involved.
Now, seismologists claim that much of the damage that's been caused across Christchurch has been caused by a phenomenon called liquefaction. A couple of days ago, we had never heard of that term, but everyone speaks about liquefaction, and indeed, you can see it everywhere around you because this quake was relatively shallow, just 5 kilometres below sea level, and what it's meant really is that a lot of that soil has turned to mud. Carl Eberle has the details on this story.
In just moments, roads turned to quicksand, swallowing cars and swamping suburbs.
Moments.
Oh, it was straight after the earthquake, mate. That was frightful.
This process, called liquefaction, has left much of the city a soggy, crumbled mess.
But the liquefaction, I mean, the suburban streets are like rivers.
You see these ladies over here, they're just sinking.
The silty, saturated layers of soil just below Christchurch were so severely shaken they liquefied. And with much of the city built on soft earth, seismologists believe the phenomena has heightened the devastation.
It is a major contributing factor for Christchurch, there's no question.
Current building regulations don't account for liquefaction.
The building code looks at shaking of the buildings, and it assumes that the foundations will remain stable.
Yet it could claim Christchurch's tallest tower, the Grand Chancellor Hotel. After September's quake, aftershock instruments were installed right throughout the city to measure each event. They'll now provide rare and accurate data recorded from the epicenter of Tuesday's tragedy and most likely help revolutionize construction in the future.
A lot of the information that we've recorded here will help us design better buildings for areas where that's likely to be a problem.
Cold comfort for Christchurch. Carl Eberle, 10 News.
Now, seismologists claim that much of the damage that's been caused across...
Let's look below the surface to learn how a sand boil forms, okay, and how this is related to what we are talking about here. We'll cut away a section here. Notice that the earthquake causes the source bed, the sand, to liquefy and be forced up through the overburden. Notice the sagging and the slumping of the overburden. And in some cases, the material will spew out on the surface as sand volcanoes or sand boils. This happens very, very rapidly in a matter of minutes, not days, years, or, millions of years. Notice that when the attenuation of the source bed due to loss of the liquefied sand causes a slumping of the overburden because they're soft, and the overburden slumps in to the lower sand bed. Now let's take a look here in Utah, where I showed you the cross section of some of those pipes. We have here two large parallel sand pipes, okay, illustrated here as having come from a lower source bed. And what do we see? The overlying sedimentary rock slumped down into the source bed, towards the source bed, as it is depleted and attenuated. Okay, now we've had several geologists, Anderson and Sprinkle from the Utah Geological Association, says that this type of a structure is a slumped graben structure. This is a misnomer, okay? This is not a graben structure. This is a soft sediment deformation, indicating that all these rocks were soft at the time of the earthquake, and that the sand layer was not sitting here for millions of years being covered over and waiting for these overburden to become hardened into lithified rock. Okay, all of this was soft at the time. It is not unlikely that the sand layer saturated would stay saturated anyway for millions of years, if indeed it took 10 million years for the overburden to accumulate. This is not a graben structure. This is a classic soft sediment deformation, indicating that all of these layers were soft at the time and did not have time to harden. This is a indication of rapid sedimentation. Unlike the fossils, the rocks themselves structurally talk to us that all of this section in Utah was basically unlithified at the time. Now, a graben structure, if it was a graben, would look like this. When rocks are hardened and layered rocks, and they are subject to an extension force, the rocks will fail, the grabens will fail along high angle normal faults, leaving horse, which is the higher mountain areas, to erode down into the valleys. This is what we have in the western United States in many places, known as the Basin and Range Province. And this is a type of field work you would see is a hard rock deformation. Okay, as illustrated here, you see that this layer has fallen down along a high angle fault into the lower level due to tensile forces, but it is not slumped layers. Here again is a layer that is along this fault, has dropped down. This is dropped down relative to this along a fault because when this happened due to tensile forces, the rocks were already in a lithified, hardened state. But what you see in Utah is a slump structure, not a graben. These are formed in many, many places around the world. They are not just unique to Utah. These pipes and dikes, seismites are found all over the world. I don't want to bore you with the many, many references, but how could the source bed remain as loosely packed saturated sand for tens of millions of years awaiting an earthquake? These structures are common to many areas of the world. the classic dikes. And I have many references here, but I'm going to have to skip over all these references. We don't have time for all that. Connect the dots. Similar timescale problems in many other areas throughout the geologic column lead to a reasonable conclusion that sedimentary covering of the Earth was in a soft, saturated state at a synchronous time in the past. Scripture contends the Earth is about 6,000 years old, folks. No one of these evidences, circumstantial in itself, can present a substantial case, you might say. But the accumulated evidence is pointing to a conclusion which unites all the evidence and therefore leads to a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. Conviction, or you might say conclusion, beyond a reasonable doubt. Because if you were to try to come up with an alternate explanation, it simply cannot fit into the accumulated evidence. Reasonable conclusions. The Bible contains a chronology of Earth history from creation to the birth of Christ of 4,000 years. It has been calculated by many scholars. There is simply no way to take the biblical chronology and extend it to tens of thousands, no less millions of years. The existence of fossils exhibiting numerous examples of incredible preservation throughout the entire geologic column point to worldwide synchronous, rapid, catastrophic burial. The common admixture of continental and marine fossils often from diverse ecosystems requires inundation and burial by high-energy oceanic floodwaters. The existence of seismically induced injectites in the form of sandpipes and dikes penetrating hundreds of feet of sedimentary strata is more reasonably attributed to rapid deposition of all the enclosing rock formations. In other words, these formations were not there accumulating over tens of millions of years. So evolution's deep time is definitely on trial. Is the defense of historical deep time reasonable? I believe the defense is not reasonable. The defense is eliminated by the evidence, the accumulating evidence. It's contended that the cumulative evidence is unified and points to an explanatory alternative corresponding to the biblical record. Millions of years. Folks, who is wise out there? Let him give heed to these things and consider the loving kindness of the Lord. I do have a book that I published. Every person will choose to believe, by default, either an eternal God or eternal dirt. You only have one lifetime to get it right. Maybe you're not a minister giving lectures or standing up in front of crowds, but if you buy a book like this and hand it to someone who you know will not step into a church, this could help get them to the right conclusion. My website is godordirt.com. You could order the book. It has 15 illustrations, 3 charts, 15 pictures, and 3 tables. It is not just solely text. You could get an e-copy, an e-book, or a hard copy ordered right from here, godordirt.com, on our book case drop-down menu. You could also make a donation to the ministry if you're so inclined. And Donnie, if you'd like to have a season of questions and answers, I'd be glad to come around. I will just minimize this so we could see you.
Yes, looks like it's minimized. Sal, that was a phenomenal presentation. I don't know how anybody could be an evolutionist or a proponent of deep time uniformitarianism after watching that presentation. So many good points you touched on. One thing I will point out is that it really is amazing that what we see, Sal, from literally the top to the bottom of the geologic column, as you've shown throughout your presentation, for one, we don't see any real large scale evolution. But two, we find marine fossils, massive numbers of marine fossils mixed with all types of creatures, all different types of ecosystems, mixed with horses, mixed with birds, with dinosaurs. We even find evidence.
And many of these fossils are living fossils. They're alive and well today, showing no evolution during that geologic period.
Amen. We see stasis. We see stasis. These evolutionists have to believe that creatures that have not changed over millions and millions of years of supposed evolutionary history, environmental changes, they've just stayed the same. You know, the coelacanth comes to mind. But one thing, Sal, that I'd like to point out is that we find evidence of animals running from the floodwaters as we find animal tracks before we find the actual animals themselves. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I point that out is because I've actually heard critics of the global flood model try to imply that fossilized footprints are a problem for the Genesis flood, when in fact it would be a problem for the uniformitarian.
Yes, in the Permian, we find tracks of amphibians and such quite often, like in the Coconino sandstone and other Permian formations. But we never find the fossils. That's remained a mystery, you know. In the cross-bedded sandstones, we find the tracks, but guess what? Where the fossils are at a much higher elevation, and there we find the fossilized remains of the amphibian, but no tracks. Obviously, they were trying to escape the floodwaters. They were literally picked up, swept away, and tried to survive during the flooding, and then became entombed at a higher level in the sediments. That's why the tracks, like the dinosaur tracks and the fossils of the dinosaurs, are not found in the same place.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Great point, Sal. I've got a ton of questions here, so maybe what I'll do is get right to some of these questions. I got to say, an hour and a half flew by. I want to tell the audience to share this video, share this presentation, this type of information. The truth is so important, and I want as many people as possible to see this. So great job, Sal. And a lot of these questions kind of came in during the presentation. So if you kind of touched on it during your talk, Sal, I apologize. But I'll start with the most relevant questions first. And here's one that constantly comes up, Sal. And you did touch on this in your presentation. The question is, evolutionists claim that fossils, and specifically the ordering of the fossils in the geologic column, is evidence of large-scale evolution. Is this really what we see? Or is there a better explanation for the sorting of fossils in the geologic column, Sal?
Well, the fossils that we find throughout the geologic column are not sorted as neatly as the textbooks show you and as students are told. There is definitely what would appear to be a progression from simpler forms, if we could call any organism simple. That's not really a true fact, but from smaller organisms to larger organisms, there is somewhat of a progression as you go up in the strata. but there are numerous exceptions worldwide. In other words, out-of-place fossils to this. So we would expect, as the floodwaters were rising, that the various environments would have the inhabitants of those environments would be buried in a sequence. Starting with the bottom of the ocean, where we find mainly the crustaceans, and then fish going up into the Devonian, and continuing on up into the, we get into the Permian, where you have both amphibians and some mammals, follow me, as the water were rising, and then you get into the mammals and then the reptiles, etc. These animals are at various elevations of environments as the waters arose, plus they have the ability, many of them, to try to escape, just like human beings had no doubt tried to escape the floodwater. So there is a somewhat of a progression of environments as the waters rose, but there are so many exceptions to out-of-place fossils, as we would expect, due to mixing, due to the energy of the currents. Like we said, within the dinosaur bones, there is all kinds of marine organisms and plants and mammals and such. So there are many exceptions, but the museums in their dioramas do not show this. You will hardly ever walk into a museum of a dinosaur display and show the numerous plants and animals, living plants and animals, living fossils, that is, so to speak, that are found with them.
That's a great answer and very informative, Sal. And we also know that from the Bible, from the account in Genesis, I like to point out that a river flows out of Eden. And since we know rivers flow downhill, then we can assume that there would have been different elevations in the pre-flood world, and therefore different ecosystems where we would have mammals separated from reptiles, humans separated from dinosaurs. And the whole ecological zonation hypothesis of the ordering of the fossil record makes sense. Burial by ecosystems, burial by communities, as compared to, as you were pointing out, the evolutionary story that would say from more simple organisms to more complex. But I like how you pointed out, in the Cambrian, we find creatures such as the trilobite, and their lens system is highly, highly sophisticated and complex. So there's nothing simple about the organisms that we find on the bottom in the first place.
No, there isn't. There is no simple organism, living organism on the face of the earth, and that includes even microorganisms. Single cell microorganisms are a universe of complexity within themselves.
That's a great point, Sal. Well, that being said, the next question here is, it has to do with some of those rare fossils that evolutionists point to. So the question is, Sal, what are your thoughts on the claimed so-called transitional forms? And a couple examples listed are the whale series, Tiktaalik, Archaeopteryx, but in general, the transitional-like forms. What do we make of those from a biblical standpoint?
There are a whole number of proposed transitional fossils that are proposed by evolutionists. Probably more than a dozen. Tiktaalik is one. You have the whale series. Just take the whale series. If you watch a video about it, you'll see that when the one of the chief proponent of the whale series himself, who helped to formulate the pictures, so-called pictures of the transition of the whales, readily admits, when he was confronted with the evidence, that the evidence is not there for the evolutionary progression of the whale. He admits it himself, that the fossils do not and cannot show a progression of whales, which is almost comical in itself to think that a mammal could go into water and transition into a whale. The number of differences in the animal itself, of all its organisms that would have to transition is enormous. And so many of these series are shown without really very much fossil evidence at all. Now, here's the fact, though. We have literally, I don't know, millions of species on the Earth. And if, in fact, evolution was true, we should see evolutionary evidence of one animal transitioning to the other. Even today, we should have such a huge variety of transitions between one type of creature to the other that it would look like Star Wars. It would literally look like Star Wars photography, on the Earth. And we don't have these millions and millions of transition today, types of animals. That's why you could go into a biology textbook and identify whether this is a reptile, whether this animal is a amphibian, whether it is a fish, whether it is an invertebrate. We have all these classifications because they're real, and the animals are distinct. If evolution were true, it would be just a merger between all these major phyla and classifications that you wouldn't be able to hardly identify the difference between one animal or the other. In other words, we should see countless millions, in the fossil record and the living record. The museum should be full of thousands and thousands of examples of transitions, complete examples, a complete series. All we have is a handful of so-called proposed transitions with just very few fossils to try to justify this story.
That's a great response, Sal. The fact that the evolutionists can only look and point to a few rare so-called transitionals shows just how inconsistent the story really is. And I like to point out that what we are looking at today is merely just a snapshot of the overall diversity in terms of the entirety of Earth's history. So some of these interesting mosaics that we see in the fossil record is simply just a reflection of pre-flood and immediate post-flood diversity. And I find the evolutionists make that uniformitarian assumption that what they see today is exactly what it would be like in the past, but with a greater diversity in, say, the pre-flood world. Of course, we're going to find a few interesting mosaics, but it's the fact that they are so rare. Like you pointed out, we should find so many more where there's this nice continuous series showing that large-scale evolution. So great point, Sal.
Well, this is true. And when you consider the fossil record, what we see from examining fossils, that the variety in the past was greater than what we have now. I mean, even though we have countless numbers of varieties of species and genera, many of them have apparently gone extinct because we see a variety of plants and animals in the fossil record that no longer exist. Now, according to evolution, the variety should be increasing. Okay, but what we see is a greater variety in the fossil record, indicating there was a extinction of many different species and genera and families of plants and animals. This is the opposite of what you would expect from evolutionary propaganda.
And even today, we could point to some very interesting mosaics like the platypus. The platypus has a very interesting set of traits that if it were extinct and the evolutionists were to dig up the platypus, they would have all sorts of interesting interpretations based on evolutionary propaganda. Even if every single, you've probably heard this before, Sal, every single domestic dog that we see today, the incredible variety in just the domestic dog, if they were all buried suddenly in a flood and dug up thousands of years later, just based on the variety in that one single domesticated species, they can line up the bones any way they want based on the evolutionary suppositions and assumptions. So,
Yeah, that's true. And, extinction is not evidence for evolution.
exactly right. Exactly right. So I'm looking through these questions here, and this I hear all the time. And I think you sufficiently refuted it in your presentation. But since even the uniformitarian, Sal, has to admit that at least at one time, it appears that the entire Earth was once underwater. They'll just look to multiple events in Earth's history to explain that. So they'll say, they'll look to many local floods to explain the fossils rather than one major global flood. What would be the best response to that?
Well, like I said, everywhere where we see rapid burial and intense energy environments during the burial conditions, both in the rocks and the fossils, they attribute it to a local. They are even using the word now, catastrophe, because the evidence is so overwhelming. But what they claim is that when you say this is a local catastrophe here, a local catastrophe there, and everywhere you look around the Earth in the fossil record is local, the local becomes it has no meaning. It's
Right.
universal. What we see is a universal pattern of flooding and catastrophe and high energy and rapid burial. But what they will claim is that between these so-called local catastrophic burials, there was a huge amount of time in between those various periods, those cycles. But the evidence for that time is not basically there, because the rock strata themselves are stacked upon one another without any circumstantial or even direct evidence that there was a period or huge periods of erosion between these so-called local catastrophes. The evidence for the time frame between them, the erosional period, is simply missing. We will cover that in the next presentation if you have me back, because I'm going to go into detail of the unconformities around the Earth and the so-called missing time that the evolutionists claim is contained within these unconformities.
Okay, then I was going to say a couple things on that, but what we'll do is we'll save that for your next presentation. We could listen to you all day, Sal, so we are more than happy to have you back on. And to the audience then, stay tuned, as we will be focusing on that, which is a very interesting topic and a major problem for the uniformitarian, Sal. So I look forward to that. So why don't we then go to the next question and kind of save that for your next presentation, because the next question has to do with petrified forests. I've seen critics of the global flood model look to petrified forests. For example, Sal, the petrified forests of Yellowstone National Park. They'll look to this as an argument against the biblical timeline. So the question is this an argument you are familiar with? And is it actually a problem for the global flood and the young earth creation model?
It is not a problem whatsoever. We've always suspected that, number one, petrification is a very rapid process. We don't have to suspect it. We have evidences of logs and fence posts and various items of food, clothing, machinery being covered with rock, so to speak, petrified, especially wooden products like logs and fence posts, within a matter of a few years to a few weeks. Right now, there are labs that will petrify your furniture if you want. You want to pay for it. They actually know how to petrify. That means turn the rock, your rocking chair, in a relatively rapid time. So the mechanism of petrification does not take thousands and millions of years. That has been shown uncontestably around the earth now. Now, the way these petrified forests form, we've learned a lot since Mount St. Helens. But the ones that are lying down, like in northern Arizona, and many areas of the country have petrified forests, so to speak. But I'll give an example here of the famous petrified forest in northern Arizona. When you look at these trees, they're invariably, there's no limbs on them. The bark has been scraped off. The tree roots are gone. They're uprooted, busted tree trunks that have been busted loose from their roots. The bark scraped off and the limbs are gone. And on top of all of that, they've had measurements done to show that there is a preferred orientation to many of these, not all of them, but statistically, there is a very distinct orientation to these logs as they lie on the ground, which is very indicative of having been deposited there by rapid flowing waters and orienting them to some extent. Of course, with the energy flow of the waters here and there's going to be slightly different orientations, but there is basically statistically a particular orientation to these logs, like up here in the Arizona petrified forest. The one that you mentioned where the trees appear to be vertical, they've examined these. Again, they're vertical, but there's no tree roots. There's no limbs. The bark is gone. They're not in situ. They were not buried successfully as forests that were buried over time, over millions of years, one forest on top of the other, accumulating these vertical petrified trees. They're not in situ. They were laid down, but we now know that how trees tend to float when they're become waterlogged after a few months. The heavier end, which is the tree root end, even though the roots for the most part were ripped up, the end near the tree roots is more dense, and it tilts down, and the trees begin to float in the water vertically. This has been all documented around Spirit Lake in Washington after Mount St. Helens exploded. And they eventually they float vertically and descend down into the mud and get stuck in the mud vertically and are buried by successive layers of volcanic sediments. So that's the reason why you have this vertical ascension of these tree trunks that are rootless. They don't have bark on them, and they're in a semi-vertical position.
Well, that's a great question to a common argument, especially from the old Earth creationists. I believe I've seen people from the Hugh Ross camp use that argument. So they're assuming 50 or more successive events with these forests, when in fact the evidence you're suggesting and the rapid petrification we know that can take place would be the uprooting of these trees in one global catastrophe.
Correct, and they're not in situ. These trees were not buried one forest at a time on top of each other. They are scattered vertically, helter-skelter, at different elevations without their tree roots. They dug down into these trees to find the roots. They're not there. which is typical when trees are overwhelmed by high energy water and are broken down and causing amber deposits, from all the fractured wood, and the trees are uprooted as they scrape on each other in high energy waters. They tear off all the bark, basically, which is what we find in many cases, and the limbs are all busted off.
Well, I love that answer, Sal, because I find it kind of funny that the arguments that the critics hold up as some of their best arguments against a global flood turn out to be just more evidence for the global flood.
Exactly.
So
everywhere where we look on the earth, it confirms Scripture.
Exactly. Amen. Amen. So I've got a question here from the audience. It came in recently, so I was able to put it up on screen. And the question's from Health First and Feeling Second. So question for Sal. How reliable is potassium argon dating? I know this dating method has been applied to volcanic rocks and meteorites, but is it scientifically trustworthy?
It is not trustworthy because, not because Mr. Giardina says it so. It is not trustworthy because we have samples that are taken using this method, producing all different sorts of dates. It's sort of like a person on a street corner in New York City with a big coat, and he opens up his coat, right? And all in it, it's full of Rolex watches, he's telling you. He goes, I have a good buy for you on these Rolex fabulous timepieces at a bargain price. And you look at it, but you notice that all the watches have a different time on them. So you highly suspect they're not accurate timepieces and Rolex watches. You know what I mean? It doesn't take a genius. So it's the same thing when we use these methods to date various rocks, and they come out with different times within the dates. They can't correspond to each other. The dating doesn't always correspond. Over and above that, when we use them to date rocks of known age, in other words, rocks from igneous lava flows that have been formed on the surface of the earth, and somebody has stuck a stake in it with the date and the time that the rock is solidified. And we have flows like that, basalt flows all over the earth, where we know exactly when it erupted and when it solidified. We know the age of the rock. And you use these methods to date these rocks. They come up with time frames that are many orders of magnitude out of order. In other words, we know that the rock was formed 50 years ago, 75 years ago, and we come up with ages in the hundreds of thousands to millions of years old. So we're not talking about a small discrepancy of 10, 20, 30%, or even 50%. We're talking about orders of magnitude in error. They're in error by, 5,000%. So if you cannot date accurately rocks of known age, how can you trust the date of a sample of an unknown age? And as I showed you previously, when you submit these samples for dating, they want you to inform them of what you expect the date of the sample to be.
Right. That's such a great response. We can't even get accurate dates for rocks of known age, but yet they want us to trust the dates derived from rocks of unknown age.
Yes. And we know why a lot of these do not work. It's not that it's a mystery. I mean, it was for some time. We knew that they weren't accurate and these methods didn't work. And we weren't exactly sure, say 20, 30, 40 years ago, why they didn't work. But now we know why they don't work, because these samples are an open system. And everything in an open system is subject to the radioisotopes, the parent and the daughter products of either being added into the sample over time or leached out, or the daughter product being added to or leached out. Not to mention, we don't know what the initial amount of proportions were. We weren't there. And so this is an absolute certainty. This is not guesswork. We know that uranium will dissolve in waters and go into certain areas and accumulate where you have concentrated uranium deposits, or it can be leached out. At Dinosaur Ridge in Colorado, I took a group of students, a large group of students at a certain time of the year to Dinosaur Ridge. And I had a Geiger counter with me, and the students were amazed. I put the Geiger counter up to the dinosaur bones, and the thing just went off like crazy, making noise, And I go, well, how come these dinosaur bones are radioactive and all the material around it is not? The rock around it is not, Well, the reason is the uranium migrates because it's an open system through the rock, through groundwater, and uranium likes to precipitate in organic matter. That's what I believe is some of the uranium mines are found, where the uranium is concentrated in fossilized organic matter and such. I'm not an expert on that area, but I know the uranium has migrated into the dinosaur bones, okay? And the dinosaur bones now are radioactive, so to speak. The Geiger counter just goes off like crazy, Well, that shows you without doubt that these samples that you try to date are an open system in the Earth's crust. And the parent and the daughter products can migrate in or out or both over time. They are not closed systems. When I was in university, we were taught how to calculate the age of rocks. Being an engineer and familiar with mathematics, I could do it fairly easily, based on drawing a box around the sample on the page on my desk, assuming it was a closed system, and then doing the math. But that's an unrealistic system. And I didn't even realize at the time that, what they're dealing with and trying to teach me is an unrealistic closed system. There is no such thing as a closed system for a sample that's being dated on the Earth.
Well, that's a great answer. That is the fatal blow to the reliability of dating methods. You've experienced it firsthand, Sal. That's great. Okay, so the next question here, actually, I've got this one saved on my phone, Sal, and great answers so far and great questions from the audience as well. This one comes in, Sal, from Raman. Raman says, why do evolutionists accept rapid ice burials during the Ice Age, but not rapid burial in all sediments?
Could you read that again?
Yeah. Why do evolutionists accept rapid ice burial in Ice Age? So maybe rapid localized floods during the Ice Age, but not rapid burial in all sediments. I guess that kind of comes back to that same question that we addressed earlier with how they look to all these local floods as compared to a worldwide flood. Maybe it's just worded a little differently.
Well, I'm not sure that what he's saying is what evolutionists actually believe. I don't know about on a local basis within the great ice sheets that cover the Earth, like in the Antarctic or Greenland. But overall, evolutionists believe that these ice sheets have accumulated slowly over millions and millions of years. Okay. They are not due to rapid accumulation.
Thank you, and thank you for the question, Raman. This next question comes in from Redefine Living. Thank you for the question, Redefine Living. He says, standing for truth question, is heat created in the moving areas of liquefaction?
The question is heat created?
Is heat?
Not that I'm aware of. Liquefaction absorbs the energy of the earthquake going through the ground, and like I showed, the particles of disperse from each other. They form like a slurry, a sand liquid slurry, and the energy of the earthquake, along with the weight of the overburden over it, cause it to be injected through the overburden as dikes and pipes. There's no particular heating that I've ever come across or heard of the sediments during this process. It could produce a little heat, I guess, because where there's energy, there's heat, to some extent.
Right. Good answer. And thank you for the question, Redefine Living. This one here comes in from Luca. Thank you for the question, Luca. He asked this all the way back, actually at the start of the presentation. So his question is, Otzi, spelled Otzi, was dated to be a 5,000-year-old man. When they found it, they were expecting a much recent date. It was believed to be a modern man. What are your thoughts on this example, Sal?
I don't know about that particular example. I don't follow all these archaeological finds. But of course, the date that they came up with, no doubt, was through radiocarbon dating. And radiocarbon dating has as many problems because it requires nearly as many assumptions as radioisotope dating does. Right. Unprovable assumptions that cannot be determined exactly. So the dating of samples by radiocarbon, you can get an approximate general ballpark date if you make certain calculations and stuff, and if you consider what might have happened in the worldwide flood to kind of change some of the parameters of the atmosphere and the vegetation, the biosphere around the Earth, you could probably hone into a little more accuracy using carbon dating, but you cannot get exact dates. Now, I listened to our archaeologists recently, and they believe that carbon dating is like a Bible to them. Boy, if they get any kind of organic material at a dig site, boy, they could date that and come up exactly, with the date. But they're just fooling themselves. A number of assumptions in it is staggering, and you just can't come up with it. But the fact that there is carbon-14 in the sample does definitely indicate that it cannot be millions of years old. That's for sure. You can't say how old it is exactly, but it certainly can't be dated greater than, say, 50 to 100,000 years, if there is any carbon-14 detectable in the sample, because of the half-life of carbon will dissipate completely, essentially in 50 to 100,000 years, depending on the equipment you're using to measure with.
Great answer. And I'd like to point out as well, especially for the audience, you, George, and myself, I believe it was either in the first or second presentation, we discussed carbon dating quite extensively, and I actually made that into a separate clip. So for people in the audience, go check the playlist for even more detail on that specific topic of carbon dating. And Sal, this next question here has to do with phylogeny and how many of these evolutionists, they look to phylogeny and classification schemes, and they'll point to the pattern of life as evidence for universal common ancestry. For example, they'll ask, why are we more similar to some creatures, such as the chimpanzees and other apes, and less similar to other creatures, such as dogs or fish? In other words, why is there a hierarchy, is essentially the question, Sal. Why did God create this way?
Well, I don't know that it is the way they're trying to explain it, because I'm not an expert on DNA by any means, but from what I know about it, the idea that we are similar to chimpanzees, like 97% similar, that has been completely debunked now for maybe the last 10 years. We are not, our DNA is not like closely related to apes and chimpanzees and primates, etc. It is unquestionably more like about 85% to 80% similar. But you would expect that because chimpanzees walk, they have arms, they have a head, they have eyes, okay? So the basic anatomy and function of that, the kind of animal, is somewhat similar, to a human being. Of course, the 15 or 20% difference is astronomical in the, what a human can do compared to a chimpanzee, as everyone knows. So,
right.
But we're not similar to within a few percent. That has been debunked. They're also trying to use comparisons of DNA in other methods to compare different types of animals and such. And I don't know. I don't think I should comment directly on that because I'm not an expert in that area.
And you make some good points, though, Sal. Just basic logic would tell us we share more in terms of morphology, anatomy, and physiology with the chimpanzee. Therefore, on a genetic level, from a genetic standpoint, of course, we're going to share more with them as well as compared to a dog or a fish. Just standing back and looking at the creatures, then of course we're going to share more with a chimpanzee than a fish. So that's a great response, Sal. And we are going on 2 hours and 5 minutes. And I don't want to take up any more of your time, Sal. I will say 2 hours have flown by. We've still got a great chat. We had up to 50 people in the chat at one point. We've had a lot of great support, and I want people to share around this presentation. It was a phenomenal presentation, Sal. And like I said at first, when it ended, I don't know how anybody could hold to deep time evolution after watching so much evidence presented during your talk, Sal. So I want to hand it over to you for some final words before we close it down for the night.
Sure. As we said, to emphasize, I'm only giving you one data set of evidence. Of course, creation scientists from many different disciplines of biology, physics, math, etc., medicine, have shown data sets that the facts are consistent with scripture, that we are created beings, and we did not evolve from non-living chemicals with a mindless, purposelessness process, a process that has no purpose, no design, no function, no forethought. It's not possible. We're at a place in science where we know that is not possible to go from chemistry to even a living single cell. So we know that. And the words that I spoke today and gave you are immaterial. We are communicating with each other information which is non-material, and communication only comes from an intelligent source so that we could understand each other. And that in itself shows that all the information within your DNA in itself could not have a material origin. it comes from an intelligent source. And so you could rely on scripture in your life, particularly in this crazy world that we live in, where the culture is falling apart and law and order is becoming more lawless at all times. And you're going to need to rely on the word of God, because Jesus said that you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free.
Amen. Well said, Sal. Well said. Thank you so much again for giving us your time. I know you're busy, and we appreciate it so much. You're incredibly helpful and a huge blessing to this ministry, Sal. We look forward to having you back on soon for the next sure to be must-watch presentation. So everybody, thank you so much in the audience. Make sure you are here tomorrow at 6 p.m. We're going to be having Professor David McQueen back with us again, talking about advanced flood geology and volcanic rock. So we'll see you then, guys. Thanks for joining us. Standing for Truth is out.